Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories. We have stories that should thrill you a little and chill you a little.
It's amazing.
What you'll hear are adventures sent in by you guys, classic stories from the pulp mags, and episodes from the golden age of radio. We have special segments like Ghost Stories with Sylvia.
That's amazing.
And These Are Your Stories. So settle in for the next hour and enjoy the show. One more thing. You just might want to prepare yourself to be taken away from today.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-minute mystery is being brought to you by Ghost Stories with Sylvia.
Did you tell them that I'm on the show today?
Yeah. I just did that.
Oh, hey, that sounds great.
Okay then. So let's get to today's FFM. I'm pretty sure it'll be amazing.
Carol, you've got to get it from Uncle John. I need that money like I've never needed anything.
Look, Alex, Dad won't just hand me $5,000 like that.
But for Pete's sake, Carol, what am I going to do?
I want Mrs. Beeston to hear you.
Oh, Mrs. Beeston, that snoopy housekeeper. I don't care who hears me. I've got to have...
Carol! There, you fool, she did hear you. In here, Mrs. Beeston.
Oh, Miss Carol, something terrible has happened. Your father.
Dad.
What is it, Mrs. Beeston?
What's happened?
In the library. Your father. He's just been shot.
The room is just as you found it. You haven't touched a thing.
That's right, Inspector. Everything is just as it was.
You three were the only ones in the house, I understand.
Yes, just Alex, Mrs. Beeston, our housekeeper, and myself.
I see. Come out here for the weekend, young man?
Why, no. Carol and I had a little business.
Mrs. Beeston, I understand you discovered the murder.
Yes. I was just going upstairs when I heard voices in the library. I hesitated a minute because I didn't know Mr. Ormsbury had a visitor. And then I heard the shot. I ran in just as a man was jumping over the railing of the patio. Mr. Ormsbury was dead.
And this gun, you say, was lying just outside that French window on the patio?
Yes, Inspector. The window was open. And when I went to close it, I saw the gun.
I see. This bruise across the victim's temple has me puzzled. If there was no struggle, and there are obviously no signs of one, where did the bruise come from?
Oh, I think I can explain that, Inspector. When I first ran in, my first thought was to get Mr. Ormsbury to that couch. I just had lifted him out of the chair, and the horrible sensation ran through me that he was dead. I let go suddenly, and his face fell hard against the desk. When I picked him up, his forehead was bruised.
I see. I can understand your shock, Mrs. Beeston.
Yes, Inspector. The whole thing was so unreal, I could scarcely believe it.
Look here, Inspector, I can't see that much headway is being made. All the while we're standing here, my uncle's murderer is getting farther and farther away.
Oh, I wouldn't say that exactly. I'd say he was getting much closer.
Closer? Inspector, you don't mean that...
That I know who did it, Miss Ormsbury. Yes, that's exactly what I mean.
But that's impossible. I saw the man myself escape through that window.
There was no man, Mrs. Beeston, and you know it. I'm arresting you, Mrs. Beeston, for the murder of your employer.
Why did the inspector arrest Mrs. Beeston? Do you know the clue? In a moment, we'll have the solution. But first...
Well, BG, what are your thoughts on this one?
Well, quite frankly, there isn't much to go on. I do think that the bruise on the old man's temple is a clue, but I really don't know.
Come on now, Alex did it. After all, he was desperate for $5,000.
So it would appear, but like all of these stories, the obvious is hardly ever the result.
I'll pretend I understand that.
And now, back to our story.
But, Inspector, I don't see what Mrs. Beeston said that leads you to accuse her.
Plenty, Miss Ormsbury. But the thing that really gave her away was her explanation of how the bruise came to be on the victim's face. Mrs. Beeston explained it by saying that the bruise occurred when she dropped the body against the desk. What Mrs. Beeston didn't know when she cooked up that story was, dead bodies do not bruise. Obviously, the victim was struck on the temple to render him unconscious before the death shot was fired. And now, Mrs. Beeston, I think you'll agree with me, sometimes dead men do tell tales. Come along. We've got a ride to headquarters.
Well, you were right.
Of course I was.
What I don't get is why knock out Uncle John and then shoot him?
Ours is not to reason why, but to do or die. In this case, John just died.
And the housekeeper, she's telling her own story now.
Quite right.
What's that you said?
Hello, and welcome to the podcast. On the show today, we're doing something totally different.
Wrong. Did you obtain permission from the producer to do such a thing?
Didn't have to. You see, I am the producer. What we have today is a full hour plus of Ghost Stories with Sylvia.
Why on earth would you do that?
Well, there was so much good stuff to cover that 30 minutes just wasn't going to do it.
Okay, but what about the 60-minute limit for the radio broadcast?
I thought about that. And if you're listening on the internet, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple, etc., you'll get the entire chat. However, if you are on the radio, you're going to get a modified version of the show. But not to worry, you can listen to the entire show by simply heading to ronsamazingstories.com.
Okay, but what's it all about?
Well, today Sylvia and I take on all the different types of hauntings and have stories or examples of each.
That sounds amazing.
It should be. So let's get it started right now. We all love a good story, but what we truly crave is a ghost story. It's time now for Ghost Stories with Sylvia. Sylvia Schultz is a librarian and author by day, but at night, she becomes a ghost hunter. Following a lifetime spent in the pursuit of the weird and the strange, her non-fiction works include Ghost of the Illinois River, Fractured Spirits, 44 Years in Darkness, Hunting Demons, and The Spirits of Christmas. We now cross over the veil and join Sylvia as she tells us more tales from the unknown. Sylvia, are you there?
Hello, come on in.
Well, it has been a moment, as you said in your email the other day.
Yeah, life's been happening, and gosh, we just haven't had the time to sit and chat for quite some time.
And you've been on the road.
I have been going out and having more adventures and collecting stories for Lights Out. But now we have the time to sit and enjoy each other's company.
And another thing you've been doing is attending some events and selling your books and talking with people?
Yeah, it's been really wonderful to get back out and see people face to face and talk with people, and it's been a real joy. And I've got events coming up planned for, from now until October, and I'm really looking forward to the summer and to the fall.
Well, that is good news.
Mm-hmm.
And have you got stuff planned for the whole summer?
I do. The summer reading program for the local libraries is Read Beyond the Beaten Path. So they are kind of translating that as a lot of outdoorsy stuff and camping and campfires and whatnot. So there are 2 libraries so far that I am at some point telling ghost stories around a campfire, which will be absolutely wonderful.
Boy, they're in for a treat.
Oh, yeah.
That is when Sylvia is at her best.
Yeah.
And I bet you love doing that. Kids, I assume.
Yes, kids, and I will just have them in the palm of my hand. It'll be wonderful. And then I do have a couple of conferences coming up where I'm going to be speaking, and just getting back out into the world. It's refreshing and wonderful, and I can't wait.
And it's so nice to be able to do it. You know, I was the other day I was out walking in the park, and for the last 2 years, there's been really nothing going on there.
Mm-hmm.
There was a baseball game in literally every diamond in the place. And there are, I don't know, 10, 15 ball diamonds in this thing, everything from softball to Little League and T-ball.
Wow.
And I just walked around and I went to the concession stand. I bought myself a Coke and a hot dog and I went and sat in the stands and I watched me some baseball.
Oh boy, that's great.
Oh man, it was like being in heaven again. I loved it. I had a great time. I can't tell you how much fun that was. But I'll tell you one thing. We have got a lot of stuff to talk about today.
We do. It's going to be fun on a bun.
We're going to do something that we have kind of hinted around about but never had. And it's quite possible that this is going to be so big that we might not get it in on just one episode alone.
But yeah, I think we're going to have loads of fun. I believe we are going to be talking about every major kind of haunting, and there are quite a few of them. So it may very well stretch on into an episode beyond this one, which will be great.
All right. Well, real briefly, we're going to be talking about Poltergeist Activity, Residual Haunting Activity, Shadow People or Shadow Creature Activity, Intelligent Interactive Activity, Portal Hauntings, and we're going to end up with the Crisis Haunt. That's what's in store for us today.
And you have to tell our listeners that we are not only going to be talking about them, we're going to be telling us a couple of stories illuminating each of these cases.
That is correct. We have gone through and we've got an example, at least one example of every type of haunting out there.
Yeah. Oh, man, you guys are in for a treat. This is going to be so much fun.
I want to point out that there are probably all kinds of different types of haunting that we aren't covering, but these are pretty much the major, what I guess you could call the big boys of haunts.
Yeah, these are the big guys.
Now, there is one that we purposely left out, and that's demonic activity. Sylvia, tell them why we're just not interested in talking about that one.
Well, the world of the demonic that's kind of a world unto itself. It is paranormal and it is supernatural, but it has a lot more to do with the religious aspects of things. And whether or not you believe in that sort of thing, it can be very dangerous.
Very.
So we wanted to keep these things light and we wanted to keep these things fun. So we decided to steer clear of those particular rocks.
So, and we have talked about demons in the past. The stories are usually pretty creepy to begin with, but they also end up being, I don't know, they can be really bad.
They can.
And so we just thought that why bring in the dark side right now? I mean, we're going to be on the dark side anyway, but why go that route? So what I guess I'd like to say at this point, if you really think that we should talk about demon activity, let us know, but we're not going to talk about it today.
Yeah, if you want us to talk about it in the future, we'll be happy to do that. But right now, it's summertime, the sun's out. We're just going to tell fun stories, and we'll save the demonic stuff for another time.
So are you ready to start this off?
Dude, you know I am.
All right, well, I am going to open us up with Poltergeist Activity.
Okay.
Now, most people may know this and some may not, but poltergeist is a form of the German word meaning noisy spirits.
Mm-hmm.
And reports of poltergeist date back all the way to ancient Rome. And the activities that takes place usually kind of starts with some knocks and bangs, and then furniture might move around by itself, or keys or whatever. And then sometimes it can become a little more intense, manifesting itself through like voices or even appearance of full-blown apparitions. But usually it starts, it runs for a bit, and then abruptly, with no warning, no mayhem, just stops.
Yes.
And people don't really know what causes it. There have been a lot of thoughts that poltergeists are the manifestation of someone in the house. They're going through some tough times, something emotional, and they act it out by causing these things to happen. Nobody knows for sure, but there are stories upon stories of poltergeist activity.
Oh, yes.
Do you have anything to add to that?
Yes. And you are right, Ron, in saying that these things might start out slow and then get really intense and then stop for no reason. That is kind of a hallmark of a poltergeist case. I got to tell you, poltergeist cases are not... They're really interesting. Don't get me wrong. I would be thrilled to bits to be out on an investigation and see poltergeist activity. But poltergeist cases are not my favorite cases to read about or write about, even because you don't know who's doing it. It could be the pent-up psychic energy of someone in the house, which it usually is. It could be a ghost that you don't know about, some historical ghost that you can't identify. And where's the fun in that? The draw for me in a poltergeist case is the activity, but I would like to know more about why this is happening, who is doing it. And very often, that's a question that never gets answered. I mean, it's super fun to have baked potatoes fall from thin air and land on the table. That's great, but I want to know why. I want to know who's doing it. So poltergeist activity is fun, but it's not my favorite.
All right. Well, would you like to hear an example of a poltergeist story?
Oh, yes.
All right. Have you ever heard of the Galloway poltergeist?
The Galloway poltergeist. Refresh my memory.
Well, it started out as a spooky but relatively harmless account in Scotland. As it went on, it became more intense the longer the alleged activity occurred. According to an eyewitness, Alexander Telfair, he's a local minister, the Galloway poltergeist haunting started in 1695 when farmer Andrew Mackey woke up to something a little bit strange. All of the ties for constraining his livestock were broken. So he went out, he made stronger ties, but they were also broken. The frightened farmer moved his livestock, but the next day he discovered a whole new phenomenon. A cow was hanging from the back of his house, its hooves barely touching the ground, and worse yet, it was a tether of hair suspending the poor cow.
Oh, my.
Then the strange allegation had a new focus. Starting at the beginning of March of that year, the first reports of stones being thrown at people occurred, particularly on Sundays and when residents were praying. As March wore on, the stones got bigger and hurled harder, according to Telfair. When he visited the Mackeys on March 21st, stones and other objects were thrown at him with such intensity, others could hear them striking him. That night, knocking could be heard on the floors and chests, and Telfair saw a frightening apparition. Here is his own words. That night, as I was once at prayer, leaning on a bedside, I felt something pressing on my arm. Casting my eyes thither, I perceived a little white hand and arm from the elbow down. But presently, it vanished. A friend of the Mackeys also reported seeing an apparition of a young boy in gray clothes that simply disappeared. Visitors to the Mackey home had even larger rocks thrown at them, and an unseen force dragged the Mackeys from their beds around the house. The activity culminated in a fire on April 5th, and when the family fled the home, they were pelted with stones. The next day, they claimed they discovered the bones and a small bit of flesh wrapped in paper at the door. The house was still intact until subsequent fires made it collapse on April 28th, and it became uninhabitable. Finally, the sheep farm burned down, and nothing remains of that farm today except for a dead tree marking the site. There you go.
Wow.
Quite the story, huh?
That is amazing, yeah. There are so many of these poltergeist stories that involves throwing stones.
Yes, that seems to be a kind of a common thread with that. I can think of a couple others here in the United States that had some stones thrown on the roof and whatnot. And they would go out and they couldn't figure out any reason for these stones to be hitting the roof.
And this is like in colonial times.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So who knows? But I have one more thing before we get off Poltergeist.
Okay.
I received an email this week, actually.
Oh.
And let's see, it comes from Julian Lambert, who lives, get this, Phantomville, Arkansas.
Now, isn't that just too perfect of a name? Phantomville.
Phantomville, Arkansas. Now, I did look it up. It is a real town, so.
Okay.
All right. So,
Arkansas has some weird places.
I think you're right about that. All right, so shall we read this email?
Yes, let's do.
I woke up one morning after a very disturbing dream. I was trying to talk to a ghost that was in my house. I have never had any kind of activity in the home, but after the dream, things have been happening. For example, my keys will go missing and I'll find them in the strangest places. Once, in the toilet. My kids are complaining of loud talking in their room at night. Neither me or my wife hear anything. I've tried to record in their rooms and never pick anything up. Also, one late night, there was a banging in the crawl space. I went in there and found nothing. Then it just stopped. What do you think is going on? And what do you think I should do? Julian Lambert, Phantomville, Arkansas. I'll let you kind of take a look at that one there, Sylvia.
All righty. Well, Julian, it sounds like you did have a poltergeist pass through. And the spirits and people who have gone before definitely try to connect with us through our dreams. I really firmly believe that. That is a time when our subconscious is most active and our defenses are down, obviously, because we're asleep. And this seems to be very common. It seems to be easier for spirits to contact us when we are asleep. It's easier for them to contact us through our dreams. I myself have had many visits, comforting visits, strange visits from loved ones in my dreams that they feel, some of them, a couple of them have felt more like actual encounters rather than dreams.
Yeah, and
I know you know what I'm talking about.
I do.
Yeah, but to have Julian try to talk to a ghost that he doesn't name in his dream, it sounds like someone was just kind of passing through.
That's kind of what I thought.
Yeah, and the thing about hiding keys, spirits were once alive. They know exactly how important keys are to us. And it sounds like perhaps the spirit, whoever it was trying to get Julian's attention by hiding the keys and revealing them in odd places, like, hey, trying to get your attention here, and making noises in the crawl space. And perhaps the spirit just did not have, perhaps Here's what I'm thinking, Julian. I'm thinking that the spirit had enough energy to make noises, voices that your children heard, make noises that you could hear as bumping in the crawl space, but didn't quite have enough energy to actually manifest that you could see whoever it was. And perhaps since everything seems to have calmed down, it seems like the spirit has moved on. Perhaps it didn't accomplish what it needed to, or perhaps it just realized that, well, this is not the place for me, and moved on to try something else. If it happens again, I hope you'll reach out to Ron's Amazing Stories and let us know.
Or Sylvia.
Yeah, reach out to me. That's fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's what happened. Is somebody was just kind of passing through.
Yeah. Well, my only comment is I think you handled it just right, and I do think that was a poltergeist activity. Has all the earmarks, starts and then stops
for no reason at all.
Yeah, no real explanations. So, I mean, we can talk sometime if you'd like, and maybe we can figure out something that may have triggered it. But for the most part, I'm going to definitely put that into the poltergeist category.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, well, let's move on to the next one, which is going to be Sylvia telling us a story. We're going to be talking about residual haunting activity. Now, residual haunting activity can occur when something traumatic, stressful occurs, such as a murder. Negative energy is literally blasted into the atmosphere, causing the atmosphere to be imprinted and record the events. Kind of like a recording tape. So, Sylvia, what do you got on the subject?
Oh, boy. Well, the first one that came to mind when we were talking about residual recurring hauntings is the ghost of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. She is one of the many ghosts that inhabit the Tower of London. And what was her crime? Why did she get thrown into the tower? She was the 72-year-old mother of Cardinal Pole, who argued against Henry VIII's position as head of the church in England. Henry VIII wanted to set himself up as the head of the church, and Cardinal Pole said, no, you can't do that. So he was in France. He was safely beyond Henry's reach when he started speaking out against the shenanigans that the king was trying to pull. But his mother, Margaret Pole, kind of suffered the royal revenge. Margaret Pole was a staunch Catholic. And when Henry VIII decided to revamp the entire church and dissolve the monasteries and make being Catholic a crime, she did not renounce her faith. She continued to practice her chosen religion. She got her lands and title taken away by the king. In 1539, she was accused of attending a Catholic protest. She swore she wasn't there, but she was arrested anyway, and she spent the next 2 years imprisoned in the Tower of London. She was not in the best of health to begin with. She was 72 years old, and this was the 1530s. So she had a nice long life to begin with. And health care in the 1530s was not what it is now, for sure.
No urgent cares nearby?
No doc in a box to visit. So her imprisonment was really rough on her. She declined when she was in prison, and it was finally decided by the king that she was going to be executed on May 27th, 1541. Now, we talk about the headsman and the executioner and chopping somebody's heads off, but what we don't realize these days, not witnessing this every afternoon or every weekend or whatever, it's really hard to chop somebody's head off.
Oh, I would think so.
You've got the skin and you've got the vertebrae holding, protecting the spinal cord, and the vertebrae are not shaped, and they're shaped weird, and it's kind of hard to get a sword through the vertebrae and the spinal column and the spinal cord itself. And there's a lot of muscles holding the neck up too. So it's a hard thing to do. And it takes real effort to chop somebody's head off, is what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
And the executioner assigned to Margaret Cole was very inexperienced. And he took a couple of swings at her before actually connecting. Plus, she was struggling. She didn't want to have her head chopped off. So the blade glanced off her shoulder. It wounded her, and it was just an absolute mess. So she actually got to her feet and started to stagger away, and it was just a horrendous show. And they finally got her head chopped off. They finally got her killed. But this was so traumatic that it imprinted itself on the Tower of London.
That's surprising.
So, yeah, it took 11 blows to separate Margaret's head from her body. So on the anniversary of her botched execution, May 27th, every May 27th, the Tower Green, that lovely green space in the middle of the Tower of London, echoes with her screams of terror as her bloody ghost relives the grotesque scene.
Yeah, boy.
Yeah, horrible, horrible stuff.
I guess what we can say at this point is that these are not intelligent hauntings. They are just what happened, and it just replays and replays. Imagine the amount of energy it took to create that residual haunting.
Oh, yeah. And sometimes the thing being reenacted is not so much violent as just very, very important. For example, if you stand on the beach at Reykjavik, Iceland on June 3rd, you might be lucky enough to see a pair of ghost ships. There are 2 Viking longships that appear off the coast of Iceland every year on June 3rd and start their annual sail towards Newfoundland, towards the New World. And every June 23rd, 20 days later, those same ships, those same Viking ships, appear off the coast of Newfoundland. So they recreate their voyage every year. How cool is that?
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So do residual hauntings ever have sound?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, they do. And I am going to share one of those with you right now. So this is really a fascinating. This is kind of a cross between a residual haunting and a time slip, because it was experienced once by 2 British women at the village of, and I have no idea if I'm pronouncing this right, Pise near Dieppe, France. Now, in 1951, these 2 British women went on vacation to France. On August 4th, they were awoken at 4 a.m, and they heard this bombardment of sound, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. There is 1951. There's not a war on. This is what in the world is going on. And then they remembered that these women both lived through the Second World War. They remembered that Dieppe was the site of an Allied practice invasion of the French coast. So on August 19th, 1942, a joint operation of British and Canadian forces attacked the German-occupied port of Dieppe in Normandy. So this was not D-Day. This is not June 6, 1944. This is kind of a practice run. So they were trying to see if they could actually accomplish something like D-Day. So the British women had lived through this war. They knew exactly what was going on. The war had only ended 6 years before. So they recognized the sound of bombers flying in formation. When they were jolted awake by the sound of men shouting, they had the presence of mind. They realized that something supernatural was going on. So they wrote down what exactly they heard. So these are the sounds that came through during this residual haunting. 1951. Around 4 a.m., the women heard the shouts of men trying to make themselves heard. Immediately after that, they heard gunfire, exploding shells, and the scream of dive bombers. 1942. At 3:47 a.m., The lead ships began to exchange shots with German ships patrolling the French coast. On shore, German soldiers shouted to each other as they got into position. 1951. At 4:50 a.m., the thunder of battle abruptly stopped. For 17 minutes, the women listened to utter silence. 1942. At 4:50 a.m., the ships stopped shelling the beach. The attack was 17 minutes behind schedule. The gunfire was stopped so that the invasion fleet wouldn't fire on its own men. 1951. At 5:07, the 17-minute silence was broken by the rolling crescendo of explosions and the shriek of airplane engines. Under this cacophony, the women heard the faint screams of wounded men. 1942. The first wave of landing craft slammed onto the beach at Poise at 5:07 a.m. Fighter planes and light bombers attacked buildings along the water's edge believed to shelter German troops. Meanwhile, the 17-minute delay was proving disastrous as men scrambled to get ashore and escape enemy fire. British ships pounded the beach in a barrage of shelling, trying to give the Allied troops some protection. 1951. At 5:40 a.m., the hotel room fell silent again. 1942. The British bombardment ended at 5:40 a.m. 1951. At 5:50 a.m., the women recognized the thunderous approach of many bombers flying in formation. Beneath this, they heard the sounds of desperate battle. 1942. At 5:50 a.m., a relief force of British bombers, flanked by heavy fighter escorts, came screaming into Dieppe to give the Allied fighters support. By now, the Luftwaffe had taken to the air, and the skies over the beaches were exploding with conflict. 1951. At 6 a.m., the sounds in the hotel room began to fade. By 6:25, even the thunder of shelling and the whine of aircraft engines were down to a whisper, and the moans of men were all but inaudible. By 6:55, it was all over. 1942. By 8:30 a.m., it was all over. The Germans were in control of the battle.
Interesting. So I'm going to go on record and say that this does sound more like a time slip than a...
It almost is.
Yeah, because you went from 1941 to 1951. Well, it's kind of like for that brief moment in time, the two places were one.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I don't know, though. Yeah. Or it could be that, again, so much energy being put into one place. Mm-hmm. It just recorded it and it replayed in 1951. That's pretty amazing stuff.
Now, here's the weirdest thing. Although the thunderous roar of aircraft engines, the shouts of fighting men, the near-deafening blast of explosions seemed to shake the entire hotel, the two women were the only people in the building who heard anything at all.
Oh, boy. That's weird. All right. Interesting. Well, shall we move on to shadow people?
Let's do.
All right. So the next one is called shadow people or shadow creature activity. Now, I could go into a big explanation of what shadow people are, but in reality, no one really knows what the heck is going on.
Exactly.
Most people will say that shadow activity is nothing more than a trick of the eye. It's always people are talking about, I see a shadow out of the corner of my eye. Mm-hmm. But other people, well, they say quite the difference. They see an actual shape. So I have an email again.
Yay.
From a listener. And this is a brand new story. This has never been on the show. It also came in this week. It is not a typical shadow story, but it represents it pretty well. It was sent in by Wilma Bishop, who writes to us from Portland, Oregon, which is right across the river from me.
Nice.
Okay, here is Wilma's story. Hi, Ron. I listen to you every Sunday on KPNL radio here in Portland. You have a great show. I wanted to share a story with you. I know that you've had a lot of shadow stories of late. Well, here's another one for you. A few weeks ago, I was playing Fortnite on my computer with my sister. Bam! We hear a loud slam and the internet goes out. We were both kind of scared, but we agreed to go downstairs and check out the internet router. We go downstairs and we look at it. It looks okay, but it's dark. I checked the power and found that it had been unplugged.
Ooh.
I put it back in and it starts to boot up. It takes about 10 minutes for it to start up, so we decide to get a snack. We head to the kitchen, and standing there, plain as day, we see a shadow of a person. It was completely black, but you could see its devilish smile. No eyes or face, they were gone, except for that smile. It was completely white. It was tall, about 6 or 7 feet. My sister and I ran upstairs. I never ran so fast in all my life. And then we hear the floor creaking. It's an old house. Then the creaking stopped. A door slammed, and we stayed in our room until Mom and Dad came home. By the way, the internet was fine after that. Okay, so this has some typical elements of a shadow man, not like some of the other ones you may have heard in the past, but again, they're usually shapeless. They don't have eyes or a nose or anything. Sometimes they don't even have the shape of a human. They're just a big black glob. And but that's a pretty good representation of a shadow story. And by the way, KPNL Radio here in Portland is a internet streaming service, and it is all paranormal all the time.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, it's a great station. So shout out to KPNL.com radio right here in Portland.
Right on.
So do you have anything you want to add about a shadow person?
Oh, well, what I have heard, I have talked about shadow people with my colleagues at conferences quite a lot. And the consensus in the paranormal community seems to be that shadow figures are usually figures of ill omen. They never have your best interests in mind. They're usually up to no good. So yeah, shadow people are not something you want to come across because it's never a good thing to see a shadow person.
There is one other shadow person's phenomenon that has become prevalent in the last few years, and that is the shadow man wearing a fedora. For some reason, there have been a ton of stories of these shadow people wearing a fedora.
Huh.
I don't have any examples with me. I've had some on the show in the past, but it's just a weird, whether it's a sub-genre part of the story, I don't know. But it's worth mentioning that.
Interesting.
Yeah. All right.
Snappy dressers, those shadow people.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, let's move on to the next one, which is intelligent interactive activity. One of Sylvia's personal favorites, I think.
Oh boy, yeah. I think it's a lot of investigators' personal favorites because that's why we get into this, is to communicate. That's what we want to do, is we want to try and communicate with these spirits that are haunting these places. So one of my favorite stories about an intelligent haunting comes from the Civil War, the Battle of Ulusty, Florida. And we don't think about many Civil War battles happening down in Florida, but yes, there were some, and one of them was the Battle of Ulusty, which was February 20th, 1864. And I won't go into the history because we're not talking about history right now. We're talking about intelligent hauntings. But some of the best stories about Civil War hauntings come from Civil War reenactors. I don't care if it's at Gettysburg or Ulusty or Shiloh or Antietam. You get reenactors going, they turn themselves into walking, talking trigger objects. And that really gets the attention of these soldiers who died on that battlefield. So they are going to show up and they are most likely going to interact. The reenactors do try to make the experience as authentic as possible for the spectators. That includes that when your character, the soldier that you're playing, gets shot, you fall down and you lay there until the battle is over and you can get up. While lying in the grass during one mock battle, one reenactor said he had an eerie feeling and he kept hearing a voice saying, "Have you seen the elephant?" And that doesn't make much sense to us today, but in the Civil War, that was a euphemism for being in combat, being in your first battle. Have you seen the elephant? So there was a reenactor named Ray Barlow who had an absolutely stunning experience in 2002. So he was helping his friend who had a sutler's booth, kind of a merchant's booth, helping his friend set up for the weekend. After they finished setting up the booth, Ray decided to take a walk along a trail in the surrounding woods. And here's what he had to say. I get a good ways down the trail and see this guy decked out in Confederate garb. I mean, he really looked the part. And on top of that, he was barefooted. He was sitting next to a pine tree and had a small campfire going. So he says, "Howdy." And I answered back, but noticed he looked pretty skinny, like really ragged. Anyway, he asked if I had a chaw, meaning tobacco. So I pulled a square of chewing tobacco out of my shirt pocket. A lot of reenactors chew and spit. It adds realism to the whole business of reenacting. I handed it to him, and he unwrapped the cellophane, cut off a plug with his knife, and put it in his mouth. Then he held the cellophane up and looked through it at the sun. He studied it for a bit and then asked me, "What's this made of?" I said, "It's cellophane." I figured he was making fun of me having something that didn't fit the period theme. He didn't say much, but asked if he could have a piece of that cellophane. I obliged his request, put the tobacco back in my pocket, and went on down the trail. Half an hour later, Ray walked past the spot again on his way back. There was no sign of the other man and no sign of his campfire.
Wow.
Ray kept an eye out for the reenactor, but he didn't see him for the rest of the weekend. When he got home, Ray hopped onto his computer and did some research. He discovered that cellophane wasn't invented until 1908.
Yeah, sounds right.
Yep. So
that's incredible.
That's super fun.
I'm going to go so far as to say that's amazing.
That is amazing. That is amazing. I have another super fun example of an intelligent haunting. This is, again, I'm not going to go into the history of this fellow's life or anything, but it's the story of Chief Buffalo Child Longlands, an actor in Los Angeles, California. He died in Los Angeles, California in 1932. So this fellow came to Hollywood and became a star, became a movie star, and he claimed to be half white and half Cherokee, and this guy was obsessed with Indians from a very early age, and he looked the part. He had long, straight black hair, eyes with a bit of an exotic tilt to them, and high cheekbones. So in 1904, this kid ran away to join a Wild West show. He ended up in Hollywood and ended up in the movies. And he made a movie called The Silent Enemy, which was about the mistreatment of the Native Americans. It was a very powerful film, and he did a really good job at it. And it was wonderful, and it got a lot of attention. He also wrote an autobiography, and he kind of morphed himself into a character called Chief Buffalo Child Longlands, son of a Blackfoot chief. He wrote this autobiography, and critics called the book authentic and an unusually faithful account, and Variety magazine gushed about this fellow. Chief Longlands is an ideal picture Indian because he is a full-blooded one. He's an author of note in Indian lore. And in January 1931, it all fell apart. There was a Native American consultant on the films The Silent Enemy. And this guy, Chauncey Yellow Robe, who was actually Native American, and he had heard rumors that Longlands was not actually Indian, that in fact he was colored. He was black, not Native American. So he confided his suspicions to the studio's lawyers, And Longlands was brought in front of them and asked to prove his Indian heritage, and he couldn't. His family background had just a whiff of Cherokee because the blacks did intermarry with the Cherokee, but he was not the full-blooded Indian that he claimed to be. So his Hollywood career kind of fell apart. He was snubbed by society. He just was not prepared to go back to the place he'd grown up, where everyone knew he was not Native American. It was sad because his genetics gifted him with a Native American physique, but genetics also dictated that he was black, and therefore he was considered inferior at that point in history. So he took matters into his own hands, and on March 20th, 1932, he did commit suicide. He shot himself in a cottage on the estate of his friend, socialite Anita Baldwin. Now, this estate that used to belong to Anita Baldwin is now the Los Angeles Arboretum. And the cottage where Longlands committed suicide still stands. As a matter of fact, it is the very house that is depicted in the opening scene of the original Fantasy Island.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Where Tattoo is the tower on the top of the cottage is where Tattoo ran up and rang the signal bell and shouted down to Mr. O'Rourke, "De plane, the boss, de plane."
Mm-hmm.
And suave, elegant Mr. O'Rourke came out of the front door to say, "Welcome to Fantasy Island." And I watched that show so often when I was a kid. I just loved it and didn't realize it had anything paranormal about it. But this is where it gets super fun because Chief Buffalo Child Longlands has appeared as an extra in a crowd scene on Fantasy Island.
You're kidding.
No, he
Wow.
died in 1932, but members of the crew not only saw him when the show was in production, they occasionally spoke with him. And somebody finally figured it out because they found a photograph of this actor from the 1930s and showed it around on set. And many of the crew recognized him as that guy who kind of hangs around sometimes.
Wow. That's amazing.
And producer Aaron Spelling knew about it. And he's like, well, you know what? If he wants to be in a crowd scene, let him be in a crowd scene. I don't have to pay him. That's fine.
Okay, so here's my question. Do you know what episode that was?
No, man. I wish I did.
Oh, man, we're going to have to research that. I tell you what,
No.
I'm gonna research that, and if I find it, I will put that in the show notes of what episode that is.
Totally.
Okay.
So
That's great.
yeah, and I really enjoy intelligent hauntings because that's what I go out and do. I sit in spooky places, dark spooky places, so you don't have to. And I try to talk with these spirits that are there. And I have been lucky enough to have conversations with these intelligent spirits. I mean, we've talked about Chris before on the show.
Yeah.
And we've talked about Susie at Malvern Manor.
Yes.
And we mentioned at the beginning of the show, I have been going out to conventions and whatnot. And at one of the conventions I went to, I got to talk with a couple of other investigators who had also been to Malvern Manor. So, of course, we started talking about one of my favorite places to go, Malvern Manor. Mm-hmm. And they had some more interaction with Susie. And Susie's lore is that she is a grown woman, but she has the psyche, the intelligence of about a 12-year-old girl. She likes to color, and that is what you do in Susie's room. You go in there, and there are coloring books and crayons and colored pencils all over her mattress. So you have to sit there and you color with her.
Wow.
What I did, not the last time I was there, the time previous, I was coloring and I picked up a crayon, not realizing that it was purple. I thought it was blue, and I was coloring a sheep. And I said, let's color this sheep blue. I started coloring and I realized it was purple. I said, oh, that's not blue, that's purple. And I said, that's okay. We can make a purple sheep, can't we? And on my recording, I heard Susie say, yeah. So that was an intelligent conversation. And these investigators that I was talking to at this convention a few weeks ago, said that they were in Susie's room at Malvern Manor, and they were talking with her, and they caught an EVP of her saying, "I'm not a child." She is aware of the fact that people think she has a limited intelligence, and that's how everyone has approached this particular spirit in her room, by talking down to her, coloring with her, trying to interact with her as they would with a child. And these investigators got an EVP of her saying, "I'm not a child."
Incredible.
Yeah.
So I guess we can say that an intelligent haunting is a ghost that is interactive and is aware of us.
Yeah. That's the best kind.
Yep.
My favorite kind, anyway. And I speak for a lot of investigators because that's the excitement of it, is communication.
All right. Well, it's time now to move on to something I didn't even know about until quite recently, and that is portal hauntings. Have you ever heard of portal hauntings?
I have indeed, yes. I have experienced a couple.
You have?
Yes. I have been told on several occasions about portal hauntings.
Well, it turns out that they're not really a new concept, because if you watch any kind of sci-fi at all, I mean any kind of sci-fi, you're going to find a portal. And there's been some famous horror flicks that have used, I think there's one called The Gate, which supposedly opens a portal straight to hell.
Oh my.
So it's not really a new concept, but it's relatively new in the world of the paranormal. And they're considered quite controversial because little is known about what they really are, and most of it's just theory or speculation.
Absolutely.
Portals are thought to be doorways to another world or dimension which entities can travel through. It's speculated that portals are not limited to one location, region, or any kind of sacred ground. They could be pretty much anywhere. Typically, what they are is a place where strange activities, such as glowing balls of light, odd creatures, strange shapes, or unexplained mists or fog, are suspected to be a portal of some site where these energies are traveling back and forth from wherever. Now, you might think that this would be a hard thing to find a story about. Well, it turns out that a listener, Jan from Texas, sorry, all I have is Jan and that she's from Texas, had this happen to her.
Ooh.
Here's a story from my youth. I think it was the summer of 1959 or 1960. I was visiting my uncle. We were out on a hiking trail in Hill County of Texas when I was struck with wanderlust. The plan was to camp out, and it was near dark when I wandered off. I could hear my dad yelling for me, but I couldn't make my way to his voice. I remember just sitting down and beginning to cry. A minute or later, an orange orb floated around my head. It darted about, and I finally understood that it wanted me to follow it. I was only about 9, so it took me a bit to figure that out. When I did, I was taken directly to my parents and the campsite. No one but me saw the orange orb, and my uncle was quick to say that it was probably an angel. What I didn't tell them was that there was a flash of light, and this orange orb passed through it.
Oh.
And when it left the same way. So no one, I don't know if you have a different view of a portal haunting, but some of the other things that I've heard is that there is a place in like a particular room where things just appear out of nowhere. They just kind of drop in. If you remember the movie Poltergeist back in the 80s, 1984, I believe, or something like that, there was a scene where they would throw a ball and it would go through and pop back down below. Well, that isn't as far-fetched as you might believe, and things like that have actually happened.
Yeah.
Do you have anything more to add to portal hauntings?
Well, yeah, I do. When I have discussed portals with my colleagues, a lot of the time, portals are referenced as places where spirits are coming and going quite a lot. Just like we would think of a portal in a sci-fi movie. It's kind of a doorway where spirits are it's kind of a hot spot for spirits to get back and forth between this realm and wherever it is they're going. So yeah, portals are definitely a thing. And I think I'm running across more stories of portals the more I read and the more I talk to people. So people are becoming they're realizing more that portals are appearing and that spirits are using portals to get back and forth.
All right. Well, we have one more type of story, and this is called the crisis haunt. And typically these types of hauntings are they kind of incorporate everything, really. It's kind of intelligent sometimes. Sometimes it might be residual. Sometimes it could be just, Grandpa, I'm here. And so to tell us all about it, here's Sylvia Schultz again.
Okay. There are many, many stories about crisis apparitions. They are incredibly common. So it was very, very hard for me to just pick 3 of these, but here are some of the really good ones. Sometimes loved ones will make a final encore appearance as on their way off of life's stage. At about 3:30 in the morning on June 11th, 1923, a woman named Gladys Watson experienced one of these visits. She woke up to someone calling her name. She sat up in bed and saw her grandfather standing there. He said, "Don't be frightened, it's only me. I have just died." Gladys burst into tears as she was very close to her grandfather. He told her calmly that he had just been waiting to go since his wife had passed. He gave her a reassuring smile, then disappeared. Gladys's husband woke up then, and Gladys told him of her grandfather's visit. He said that it must have been a dream, and he called Gladys's parents to prove it. His mother-in-law, Mrs. Parker, answered the phone. She had been up most of the night, she said, because her husband's father had been suddenly taken ill. He had died about the time Gladys claimed to have seen him. So her grandfather did pass, and she did see. And that's kind of the hallmark of one of these crisis apparitions. It's the last visit of a loved one, and they're stopping by on their way out just to reassure you that everything's fine, everything's going to be okay. Another crisis apparition is when somebody appears in the throes of what is happening to them. And those are the crisis apparitions that are very stressful for both ghost and witness. These are the crisis apparitions that really freak people out because it's happening when the person is dying, and sometimes it's very traumatic. David Duncan, this happened in Norfolk, Virginia. 1823, David Duncan, a sailor on a merchant ship, was relaxing in his quarters, May 12th, 1823. He turned the page in the book of poetry that he was reading, and he was just chilling out with a book of poetry. Suddenly, his vision started to get blurry, and he looked up, and he kind of blinked his eyes, and he saw his wife, Martha. But he was on a merchant ship. He was on the high seas. She was thousands of miles away in Norfolk, Virginia. She was holding their 2 children, still babies, and she was screaming and begging for David's help as flames leapt up around the 3 of them. David reached for them as the vision wavered and faded, and later he found out that on May 12th, Martha Duncan and her 2 infant children had been killed in a house fire.
Oh, man, that's terrible.
Yeah, and they were buried in the graveyard at St. Paul's Church in Norfolk. And David had to choose an epitaph. So he went to the stonemason, and he had the stonemason chisel the very words of poetry that he had been reading when he had seen his loved ones begging for his help. And the line of poetry was this: "Insatiate archer, could not one suffice? thy shaft flew thrice, and thrice my peace was slain. He lost his wife and his 2 children.
That would be rough.
So that always sends chills down my spine.
You know, what's interesting about that story is the time period of when it occurred, because it wasn't obviously going to be weeks before he would actually know what happened. Can you imagine having to live with that vision
until you found out? Yeah,
and then to find out it was real? You're secretly hoping that it's not, because even a letter.
Oh, I was just tired. Right.
Even a letter would take weeks to find him, if at all.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, what a rough situation that would be.
And there are all kinds of, a lot of the crisis apparitions happen in wartime. You have pilots being downed and appearing to their families, and people, British officers in the India Raj being lost in battle in India and appearing to their relatives back in England. Loads of stories like this.
Yeah.
Another one of my favorites, this kind of comes under the rubric of a crisis apparition, but it's kind of more of a prophetic vision. It actually happened to Mark Twain.
Oh, yeah, my favorite.
Yeah. So Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, had a brother named Henry. He was the baby of the family. He was a very quiet, studious boy, and he was adored by the entire family. Now, Mark Twain modeled Sid Sawyer, Tom Sawyer's annoyingly perfect brother, after his own brother Henry, but he adored Henry. All the family absolutely adored Henry. The brothers were very, very close. Twain even got Henry a job. Twain was a cub pilot on the steamboat Pennsylvania, which ran its route on the Mississippi River. Twain arranged to get a job for his younger brother as a mud clerk, and mud clerks just did anything that needed doing. They ran errands for the crew. They ran messages back and forth. You could grab a mud clerk and say, here, go do this, and he would do it, because that was his job. They were jack of all trades, and they just had to do any job they were assigned. It was unpaid, but it got you a foot in the door. You could work your way up on the crew of the steamship. So around that time, in May or early June 1858, Mark Twain had a deeply disturbing dream about his brother. So in this dream, Twain was in the sitting room of his sister Pamela's house. He was actually he was spending the night at Pamela's house when he had this dream. So he was dreaming that he was in the sitting room, and a metallic coffin was supported on 2 chairs. And that was the custom of the time, is to have a wake in the house, in the parlor, and just have, they didn't have funeral homes then. They laid out the body in the parlor for the wake. So Twain went closer and was horrified to see Henry in the coffin wearing one of Twain's suits. On his chest was a bouquet of white roses with 1 red rose in the center. Twain woke up from this dream and was freaking out because it felt so real. It had seemed so real that he actually got up and walked several blocks trying to get away from this feeling, and realized after several blocks in the cool morning air, okay, all right, it was just a dream. It's okay. It's fine. And he went back to his sister's house, went into the parlor. There's no coffin sitting there. It's not set up for a wake. Everything's fine. So he's like, okay, phew, just a dream. But the very next day, Henry and Mark Twain set off on the Pennsylvanian on one of their runs down to New Orleans. So there was a pilot named William Brown who kind of had it in for Henry. He didn't like the fact that Henry was a mud clerk, and he just kind of cased on him all the time. And he accused Henry of not delivering a message properly, and he punched him. And Twain leapt to Henry's defense and basically beat the paste out of this William Brown guy. The captain of the ship broke up the fight and offered to fire Brown on the spot. And Twain was like, you know what? It's okay. I'll leave the Pennsylvania for now, and I'll get another steamboat. I'll return on the A.T. Lacey, another steamboat going the same place. I'll just catch up with you later on after you replace Brown. So at 4 a.m. on Sunday, June 13th, 1858, the Pennsylvania was headed upriver 6 miles below Memphis. Now, Henry's on the boat, Mark Twain is not. The ship was pulling a flatboat loaded with wood. Many of the crew and most of the passengers were asleep at 4 o'clock in the morning when the boilers exploded, demolishing the front third of the boat. About half of the 500 people on board were killed instantly. Henry was blown off the ship and suffered burns and internal injuries. Some stories say that the good-hearted Henry swam back to the ship and helped some victims escape the burning wreck. He made sure they got onto that flatboat that was loaded with wood and then cut the flatboat loose to escape the flames. He saved a lot of people's lives that way. So rescue boats arrived. They took the victims to different places for treatment for these horrible injuries that they suffered. Still, people were still dying. People were so badly injured that they did end up dying after this. Henry had inhaled superheated air, and his lungs were scorched. So Twain heard about this and rushed to his brother's bedside in Memphis. Henry fought his injuries for 6 days, aided by the attentive care of Memphis doctors. And the nurses all loved him. He was handsome. He was young. He seemed like he was going to pull through. He was polite to them. Everyone absolutely loved having him as a patient. But he seemed to be pulling through. He seemed to be out of danger. At 11 o'clock on the 6th night, a doctor, an attending physician, told Mark Twain, who was still at his brother's bedtime, that if Henry woke and couldn't get back to sleep, to ask the doctor on call to administer 1/8 of a grain of morphine to help him sleep. And Henry did wake up that night. He was in pain. Other victims were moaning and crying, and Henry just couldn't sleep. So Twain told the medical student who had the overnight shift what the doctor had said. The student measured out the dose, but he might have gotten it wrong. So Henry drank this potion with the 1/8 of a grain of morphine, or possibly more, and it put him to sleep, and he ended up dying from a possible overdose of morphine. So word of Henry's heroics in the disaster had spread throughout Memphis. Most of the wreck victims were being buried in plain wooden caskets, but the ladies of Memphis took up a collection to buy Henry a fancy $100 metal coffin. When Twain walked into the room where Henry was laid out, he felt a chilling sense of familiarity. Henry was in his metal coffin, which was laid across 2 chairs. What Twain hadn't realized was that Henry had borrowed one of Twain's suits without telling him. So the undertaker had dressed Henry in the best clothes of Henry's he could find, which turned out to be the suit that he had borrowed from Twain and had not told him about. On Henry's chest lay a bouquet of white roses. That was the only detail the dream had gotten wrong. There was no red rose among the white blooms. But as Mark Twain stood there in the parlor in his grief, an old woman came into the parlor and tucked a single red rose into the middle of the bouquet. Yeah.
Well, that, I don't know if that's a haunting or if it's haunting.
Yeah. It actually impelled Mark Twain to start a chapter of the Society for Psychical Research in America. It was founded in Britain.
I'm very aware of it, yeah.
Yeah. It's founded in Britain, but he was the one who started the American chapter.
In fact, they're still going strong today.
Yes, they are. And hopefully someday I will get to sit in on a meeting of it.
Oh, that would be fun.
Yeah.
Well, Sylvia, we have covered 6 types of paranormal activity.
Yes, we have.
I think that we have covered them pretty solidly, and I would encourage the listeners, if anything, you have any questions, any thoughts at all, please let us know. Send us an email, send us your thoughts, because I would love to know what you thought of this, and would you like to see similar things in the future?
Yes, please let us know, and we'll deliver.
All right, Sylvia. Well, tell us, we've spent a lot of time talking now, so give us kind of a closing here. Tell us what's going on with the blog and the podcast. Anything that we need to know about?
Okay, well, I'm still doing my Today I Learned every Monday. And the Today I Learned for this week was super fun. There was a food pantry in Wales that received a donation of a can of Heinz kidney soup that was 45 years old. And the soup had been discontinued 34 years before. And I was not able to find whether anyone actually opened it. I mean, you say they give rules for or suggestions for donating things to food banks. Like don't give the poor people that have to come to the food banks, don't give them like cans of lima beans and crap like that. But certainly don't give them cans of kidney soup that are 45 years old.
Yeah, but it might be worth something.
That's true. It might be worth something. That's the thing. Yeah, give them fun stuff like mac and cheese, something cool.
But kidney beans, yum.
Kidney soup. This is Wales. Yeah.
Oh, kidney soup, not kidney beans.
Yes,
My bad.
Yes,
oh, well, then I'm not interested. Yes. Never mind.
Yeah. And on the Lights Out, the next Lights Out episode, we are going to be going to the infamous Penhurst Asylum.
Oh, I have been there in a 3-dimensional format.
Ooh.
On my 3D headset, I've been to that place.
Oh,
creepy
fun.
Is all get out, frankly.
Yes, it is. It is being reclaimed by nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
amazing.
It was a walkthrough of the place, and you got to just kind of walk through the cells. I call them cells, but the rooms are quite small, and it's interesting. I'd be interested to. I'm looking forward to that podcast.
Yeah. Did you get to go down in the basement where the
yes,
Candyland?
Yeah, they took us pretty much. They take you all the way through all the different rooms and different meeting areas, and I believe they even, if I'm thinking right, they actually took you to the morgue as well. So
cool.
I don't know if does that sound right?
Yeah.
So. But anyway,
Candyland is the spookiest part of that place. The tunnels are spooky too.
Now, is that, and make sure I'm thinking right, is that the one where it's more of a body shoot than it was, or am I thinking of something else?
No, you're thinking of Waverly.
Okay.
We will be going to Waverly later on, but this week is, this episode is going to be Penhurst.
Yeah. So
and
I don't know.
The most interesting thing I saw in Penhurst was nothing paranormal at all. I'll just give you a little bit of a hint right here. And I wish I could have opened the door. I saw a door as I was wandering around completely by myself. And it was the daytime, so everything was pretty well lit. But I opened this door and I peeked inside this room, and it was a room the size of a gymnasium. And it was full of books. Books like spilling out of garbage bags and everything. It was like a book donation sale exploded in the gymnasium. And I took a picture. I stuck my phone through the door. I could barely get my wrist through, and I took a picture of it just because it was so astounding. There were so many books there. And
a librarian's best nightmare or whatever.
It was a nightmare. It truly was. And I could not even get the door open because there were piles of books against the door. It was astounding.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Well, we'll look forward to that. All right. Well, Sylvia, we have an extra long episode here, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. I want to say that I think this was fun. We certainly covered a lot of ground today.
Gosh, I hope people enjoyed it too. I certainly did.
Well, thank you for being with us, Sylvia. Once again, it's always a pleasure.
Absolutely.
Bye now.
Bye.
Ghost Stories with Sylvia was brought to you by Gladys Goodies. I always have a great time talking with Sylvia, and I learn all kinds of new stuff. If you want to visit her on her home turf, head to sylviaschultz.wordpress.com. There you will find her blog and access to the podcast Lights Out. I will have links available in the show notes. Thank you, Sylvia. Gladys Goodies treats are a 100% natural, nutrient-rich treat that pets love to eat. You can get your treats and some really cool swag for your dog and cat at GladysGoodies.com. And don't forget to use our very own promo code RONS. That's RONS. And you'll get a 20% discount on all of your purchases. That website again is GladysGoodies.com. I hope you enjoyed this edition of Ghost Stories with Sylvia. Did you know that Ron's Amazing Stories is sponsored by Audible? Audible is home to over 180,000 audiobooks, any of which can be yours. All you have to do is sign up for a 30-day free trial, and Audible will give you a free book and access to their original content. To download your free audiobook, go to audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. Thank you, Audible. That was episode number 547, and I hope that you enjoyed this special edition of the show. I want to thank Sylvia for being here today. It was a whole lot of fun. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, head to ronsamazingstories.com. There you will find any of the links I mentioned and how to contact us. Do you want to help the show? The best thing you can do is to tell your friends all about it, and please leave reviews or feedback wherever you listen. Clicking that follow or like button makes us grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.